Good evening, everyone.
Kabbalah, how are you?
Baruch Hashem. Sorry to make you wait. Okay, let's get started. Okay. So we're going to continue in the bit Yosef, I think. And yeah, it's a long one, so we're going to continue reading it. So it says here, Katab Od, he writes furthermore, שאסור להפות פירוש עם המים שנשאבו בתחילת הלילה. So he says, right, that I'm sorry, I lost the place. 1 second. Yeah. So again, I'm sorry about that. So it says, right, that you're not allowed to bake. What does that mean? That if the water, right, with the water that you drew, בתחילת הלילה, in the beginning of the night, you can't bake with that. וכתב עוד אלא לפירוש Rashi, so he says, writes furthermore, according to the commentary of Rashi, שמפרש מים שלנו שיעור לינה, so he says, right, that according to Rashi, we're talking about 12 hours and not the whole night. So it has to be for 12 hours according to Rashi, but it doesn't have to, you don't have to finish the whole night. The Koreh Techila Shevatan Tchilat Halayla. So he says he calls the beginning of the drawing of the water the beginning of the night. Vekodem Yud Bet Shaot Amud HaShachar. And before the 12 hours, it's dawn. אבל לפירוש רבי אליעזר ממיץ. Right, according to the commentary of this rabbi, im sha'avan betchilat halayla, if he drew it in the beginning of the night, mutarim, it's allowed, miyad, right away. Kol sheken kodem amud hashachar, all the more so it will be allowed before dawn. Ve'im lo sha'avan betchilat halayla, so it says if he didn't draw it in the beginning of the night, and lalush bahem. So then you shouldn't need with that. Afilu even leachar amud hashachar, even after dawn. She'arei en lahem takana, because you can't. There's no way to fix that problem. Ela shelo yu belayla b'mechubar. The only thing is that it has to be right sitting at night, right, and not not attached to the spring. Adkan lashon Rabbi Harav Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi. So that's the end of this Rabbi Mizrahi, right? As we said, it's not the Rabbi Mizrahi that we know, right? But this is all the things that he taught regarding this issue. ודרך כלל כוונתו לומר, דרבי אליעזר ממיץ, אם נשאבו מאוד מבעוד יום. So he says, in general, he wants to say, right, in other words, in general sense, that according to this Rabbi Eliezer Mimitz, im nishavu mibad yom, if the water was drawn during the daytime, be'od hashemesh al haaretz, when the sun is still right on the horizon, en lashim bahem afilu lanu kol halayla. So then we can't draw with that. I'm sorry, you can't knead with that, even if it sat all night. Dani be'oni lo nireh li ken. So he says, Maran, but Yosef, he says, I don't agree with this. ולפיכך הסכמתי לכתוב הטענות. So he says, therefore, I wanted to, in other words, he wants to hear now, right, go through all the claims of this Rabbi Mizrahi, and refute them, right? Because he doesn't agree with his approach. שהכריחו לרב ז"ל לפרש כן, ואשיב ידי עליהם ואצרפם, ואחרי כן אכתוב טענות המחזיקות סברתי. So interesting, right? So that's why this chapter is so long in the Bet Yosef, because he wants to now refute, right, all the claims of this rabbi, all the things that he claimed that has to be done. So Maran, the Bet Yosef, doesn't agree with him. So that's why we're going to go through this, right, and see how he refutes everything. Whatever. וקודם כל דבר הייתי לדקדק במה שכתב עליו. So he says, first of all, right, he says, I'm going to go, he's going to go step by step, right, and talk about what this rabbi said and refute it, whatever. על מה שכתב רבי אליעזר ממיץ, ולא מצינו שיטענו בלכל שדעתו, ז"ל לומר דלא מצא רבי אליעזר ממיץ להביא ראיה מהי דפפוניה. So he says, right, that we don't find, right, that they didn't eat that because he holds that this Rabbi Eliezer Mimitz is not able to bring a proof from that story of Fafunia that we spoke about yesterday. אלא אם כן נפרש שאותה דרשה הייתה בתוך הפסח. Unless we say, right, that lesson that he did there, right, that lecture that he did, was during Passover itself. She'ilu hayta kolam Pesach, because if it would have been before Passover, and misham raya. So it says, right, that would not be really any proof. V'ikshar Rav Zal alma al zeh. So he says, this rabbi asked a question on that. The dilma ota drasha hayta b'Shabbat. That perhaps, right, that that lesson that he did there, right, that class that he did, was on Shabbat, Shelifnei Pesach, which is the Shabbat which precedes Passover. Veitilhem lalush be'erev Pesach. So what he did was he allowed them to knead the dough on the eve of Passover. Kedei lekayem mitzvat aseh ve'achilat matzah. In order, right, to uphold the positive commandment of eating matzah. Aval b'shar yemei Pesach, but he says that but the other days of Passover, right, besides the first, the en sham kiyum mitzvah, there's no mitzvah there. Da'afal gab the lo efshar, that even though it's not possible, en alush b'hem lechatchila ad kan. So he says lechatchila you shouldn't need, right, with that lechatchila. So that's what this rabbi said, right? That was his claim. Veli meha lo ilya. So he says from there, he says, I don't agree with this. In other words, I don't think that this is the direction you have to go in, right? To understand the logic of this. So he says you can also see the opposite. So he says, since we find that that when it comes to, right, shmura matzah, right, guarded matzah, they allowed, and they were not concerned that it's going to come to being leavened. By way of this, all the more so, right, when the matzah is not a mitzvah. In other words, you're talking about just eating matzah for the sake of eating. Natir, that we should allow to have the matzah shel mitzvah chemiru chachamim. Because he says, right, that when it comes to the matzah of mitzvah, where it's a mitzvah to eat that matzah, There, the rabbis were stringent. יותר ממצה שאינו של מצווה. More so than the matzah, which is not a mitzvah. בצקות של גויים אדם ממלא קרסו מהן. Because we said, right, that when it comes to just eating matzot, for the sake of eating, we already said, right, you can even buy from a goy, the dough, and to eat that. ואילו מצה של מצוות mitzvah abaya shimur. But it says when it comes to the matzah mitzvah, to do the mitzvah, there it requires to be guarded. Okay. Mishat ktsira, from the time of the reaping, right? Le'arif ve'rambam. According to Rif and the Rambam, it has to be from the reaping. Or mishat techina lerosh. Or, right, according to Rosh, as we said, we already talked about this before, last week, right? Whatever. So according to Rosh, it's from the time of the grinding. ואם כן, איקה לפלוגה בין מצה של מצווה, מצה שאינם של מצווה. So he says, therefore, if you're going to differentiate, right, between מצה mitzvah, which is not mitzvah, מי שסובר, כן, שהרי בעל העיטור, שאינם מצווה, איפכה הוא דאיקה לפלוגה, right, it says that you should make the opposite distinction. וכבר מצינו, מי שסובר, כן, it says we already found somebody who holds like that, שהרי בעל העיטור, because the בעל העיטור והרי אבן גיאת, right, these two rabbis, כתבו דמים שלנו, they wrote that, water which, sat overnight, לא בעיה אלא למצה של מצווה. That's only necessary for a mitzvah, the mitzvah matzah. But when it comes to regular matzot, you don't need that. Right? אבל לא למצה שאינה של מצווה, ואף על פי שלא נראו דבריהם בעיני הראש, even though the Rosh didn't agree with that, מכל מקום לא עלה על דעתו לומר שהחמירו במצה שאינה של מצווה. But it says, he never had this notion, that they were stringent with matzah, which is not mitzvah. יותר במצה של מצווה, more than matzah, which is mitzvah. אלא השווה אותם, rather they equated them, right? He equated them. שכך כתב, that's what he wrote. ולא נהרה, so he says that doesn't make sense. דכל דהכה דאיקה למחש משום חימוץ. So he says, because whenever we're concerned about leavening, en lechalek ben kazait matzah, you can't really differentiate between the one kazait of matzah, olive size of matzah, l'shar achila, and to other types of eating. Ad kan hashom, that's the end of it. Amar ledivri hakol b'midya dika lemechash lechimutz. So you see from there that according to everybody, right, when there's concern about leavening, ki sharinan le b'matzah shel mitzvah. When we allow it, when it comes to mitzvah matzah, all the more so we're going to allow that in a case where it's not a mitzvah. Then Omar she'arav zal sover detama de'avra v'lasha b'mayim shelo lanu asur. So it says, right, that you can't say that this rabbi holds that the reason that she transgressed and needed it with the water, shelo lanu, with water that didn't sit overnight. Asur, it's forbidden. La mishum chimutzu. It's not because it's leavening. Ela mishum de avra aknasa de rabanan. The reason is not because it's going to leaven. The reason is because you transgressed, right, the words of the rabbis, right, who are going to fine you because you didn't do things the way they wanted. It's a fine, right? That's what it says in the Ran. The doubt Rashi, according to Rashi, Perusha Avra Belasha, that right, when we say, right, that she transgressed and she needed the dough, and since it's a fine, right, it's not really because of a concern of leavening. The matzah she'ena shel mitzvah, when it comes to matzah, which is not a mitzvah, kansu b'matzah shel mitzvah. So they find you when it comes to matzah mitzvah. Look, all right. So it says, right, if it's not mitzvah, they find you. If it's a matzah which is mitzvah, there they didn't find you. Shelo ratzu le'amid divrehem al din Torah. Why is that? Because they didn't want the words of the rabbis to be overpower the words of the Torah. Makom hazeh, right? In this place, Asmag kaiminan, asamag kaiminan. So he says that the Samag Katav, because we're talking about the opinion of the Smag, and the Smag writes, Divrei Halachot Gedolot, right, the words of the Halachot Gedolot, the Tama Habe Mishum de Mechamem Eleisa. The reason of this, right, is because they the water, right, heats up the dough when it doesn't sat overnight. So he says, furthermore, that you have to say, right, that when the rabbis forbade to knead with water, shalolan, right, which didn't sit, mishum chashash chimutz, because of the concern about being leavened, asru. They forbade. So that's the reason why they forbade, because of leavening. Ve'im ken kashetiru b'matzah shel mitzvah. So if so, when they permitted, when it comes to matzah mitzvah, kol sheken b'matzah shel mitzvah. All the more so they're going to permit when it's not mitzvah. Ve'afa pish katavaran, and even though the Ran writes, avra ve'lasha asur. That if right she transgressed and she needed, it's forbidden. Perish Rashi explains, below dame lebetzakot goyim. So he says, but you can't compare that with the dough of the goyim. Because here the rabbis, right, they find him because he transgressed the words of the rabbis. Right, yeah. So it's according to his words, mashma she'im lasha b'shogeg. It implies, right, that if he needed it inadvertently, lo mitzar, that doesn't get permitted because forbidden. I'm sorry, it doesn't become forbidden. Ela shefshar lomar. So he says it's possible to say that's talking about the dough of the goyim shelasha bifanenu, that he needed it in front of us b'mayim shelanu, with the water which sat overnight. Kimosh katabnu. Right. So in other words, you can say that maybe it's talking about the case we mentioned before, which is that he watched the goy as he did the whole job. So therefore, there's no concern. So he used the water which sat overnight, according to that. כמו שכתבנו, like we wrote, בשם רבנו חננאל, name Rabbi Chanan. אבל עיסה שנילושה במים שלא לנו, but he says the dough which was needed, right, with water that didn't sit overnight, lo asrua mishum knas. They didn't forbid that because of to give you a fine on that, to fine you. Ela mishum de chashash chimutz. The reason they did that is because of the concern of leavening. That's the end of it. The mashma de ledat Rashi lo havutama mishum chimutz. So he says, according to Rashi, the reason is not because of leavening. Nireli de leolam ledivri akol. So he says, then, according to everybody, lo asu chachamim, the rabbis forbade lalush b'mayim shelo lanu. The reason why the rabbis forbade to use water which didn't sit overnight, ela mishum chashash chimutz, is because of leavening, the concern of leavening. She'en tam acher le'asor lalush b'hen, because there's no other reason, he says, to forbid to knead with them. Mia echad de'avar belash, but he says, however, when he transgressed, right, and needed, אפשר לומר שאין חשש החימוץ כל כך. So then he says, right, that it's possible to say that there's no concern so much of leavening, כל כך גדול לחוש לו, to be concerned, בדיעבד, ודיינו שנחוש לו לכתחילה. So he says, therefore, right, it's good enough that we should be concerned לכתחילה, but not בדיעבד. So he says, therefore, אם עבר בלש, if he transgressed, right, and he needed, mutar haya min adin, it would be allowed, according to halacha, bebatzekan shel goyim. Like we said regarding the dough of the goyim, ela dekansuhu rabanan, but the rabbis find him lefi she'avar al divrei because they transgressed their words. Vezeu dat Ran b'kavanat Rashi. That's the Ran according to Rashi. B'chakach katav. Afterwards, he writes, ela she'efshar lomar, that it's possible to say that when it comes to, right, the issue of the dough, אבל עיסה שנילושה במים שלא לנו, right, we're talking about the dough of the goyim. But if when it comes to the dough, right, that was made with water, which didn't sit overnight, lo asrua mishum knas. They didn't forbid that because of fine. Ela mishum chimutz. Rather, the reason is because of leavening. כלומר, אפשר לומר שחשש החימוץ הוא כל כך גדול. So he says, so what do we say, right? It's possible to say that the concern of leavening is so great that אפילו בדיעבד חיישין עליה. We're even concerned בדיעבד, after the fact. וכיוון דעל כורכך לכולי עלמא. So he says, since that, according to everybody, לא אסרו ללוש במים שלא לנו, they didn't forbid to use water which didn't sit. Ela mishum, they only forbade it because of what? Ela mishum dechashash chimutz, because of the concern of leavening. K'sheitiru lalush behem matzah. So he says when they permitted to knead the matzah shel mitzvah of mitzvah, the lo efshar, that it's not possible. But lo chasheshu lechimutz kol sheken, and they weren't concerned about leavening. All the more so, sheitiru b'matzah shel mitzvah. All the more so they're going to permit when it comes to matzah, which is not mitzvah. The adkan. So he says, furthermore, lo aminan de kansinan le, that we didn't say, right, that we find him be'abar velash, that if he transgressed and needed, ela lefi shaya yachol lekayim divrei achachamim. Rather, right, the reason is because he was able to fulfill the words of the rabbis, velo kimam, and he did not. So he says, therefore, even if he did it inadvertently, we find him. Leferush Rashi, according to Rashi, hechade avar velash bechamin, when he transgressed, right, then he needed with hot water. Lefishahu kemo poshia, because he's like a sinner, in other words, he did something which he was not supposed to do, something which is forbidden. Aval kol she'i efshar lo l'kayem divrei hachachamim. But he says, if you're not able to fulfill the words of the rabbis, mipnei kach anu matirin lo lalush bahem. So he says, because of this, we allow to knead with that. Lo mefalginan ben matzah shel mitzvah le matzah she'ena shel mitzvah. So he says we don't differentiate between mitzvah matzah and not mitzvah matzah. Rabbi Eliezer means the alea kaiminan. So he says also according to this rabbi, right, that we're dealing with his opinion. Let le de kansinan le beshogeg. He doesn't hold, right, that there's such a thing like this, that we find him even if he did it inadvertently. Velash b'hem, then he needed with them. Sharei katab be'edia, because he wrote explicitly, im shagaga velasha mutar. That if if he inadvertently did so, right, and needed, it's allowed to use that. Hilkach kushyat. So he says, therefore, the question Harav, this rabbi, Al Rabbi Eliezer Mimitz, that he had on this rabbi, Leta mikol hanem tame, says it doesn't really exist because of these reasons that we just mentioned. Ach mitam kushiat acheret haya yachol Harav zal lidchot divrei Rabbi Eliezer Mimitz. But he says, you know what? There's another way that he could have pushed out the words of Rabbi Eliezer Mimitz with a different kind of a question, right? A different difficulty. Lidchot divrei Rabbi Eliezer Mimitz vehi the dilma. Drashat Rav Matna Haita b'Shabbat. So he says that perhaps, right, that this rabbi who made his lecture, right, whatever, it was on Shabbat, Sharifnei Pesach, on the Shabbat that precedes Passover. Da'aitu kuli alma chatzavayu be'erev Pesach. And everybody brings, right, their the eve of Passover, right, their tray, whatever. Tzivah shelo yalushu hamatzot bo bayom. So, right, he commanded them that they shouldn't knead, right, the matzot on that same day, until the night. Sheishavu, right, that they draw the water. As they drew the water. As vehem mutarim, and now it's allowed. Miyad, right away. Ladat Rabbi Eliezer Mimitz, according to Rabbi Eliezer Mimitz, Atzmo. Ve'im ken eno yachol le'avi raya mi'ayid defafunia. So you can't bring, it says, according to that, you can't bring a source from this rabbi, right? That the story that we told over. That lechatchila we can even use dough which was made with the hot water. The lo efshar because it's not possible. V'zo kushiyat chazaka. So this is a difficult, it's a strong question. It's a strong challenge. Ve'eni yodea ech lo shat harav zal libo al'eh. Says I don't know. He says how the rabbi didn't notice that. Lidchot divrei Rabbi Eliezer means that he could have pushed out the words of this rabbi. Since he mentioned it in his words, right, in his beperush divrei Rabbi Eliezer means when he explained the words of this rabbi. V'yashuv kushia zo. So he says, "V'yishuv kushia zo." He says the answer of this question, "Echtov b'samuch b'siyati dishma." I'm going to write later on. Okay, so we just read like a big chunk over here. So let's see how much more we got. Yeah, it's still long. So let's see where we are here. Okay, so what do you call it? Let's continue reading a little bit. Ori Rabbi Yitzchak, he says, my rabbi Rabbi Yitzchak, right? Omer, he says, Lo nitna Torah lemalchei hasharet, right? The Torah was not given to angels. So v'havale lemitne shelanu kol halayla. So therefore, you should have said, right, that the water was sitting all night, sat all night. Ela en lina ela mechatzi halayla ad amud hashachar. והטעם לפי דעתו משום דרוח צפונית מנשבת עד הבוקר. So he says the truth is, that you only need really the second half of the night that it should sit. Why is that? Because there's a northerly wind, right? Northern wind, right? Which blows until the morning. Yeah, so that north wind, right, that comes, it's cold, right? It's coming from the North Pole. So it comes, right, and cools down the water. So he said, that's good enough already. You don't need the whole night. Half night is good enough. So it was also written in this book, this idea. So he says now, right, says the Bet Yosef, right, halachically speaking, right, what do we do, right, bottom line, right? We saw that there were several ways of looking at this whole thing. So he says, right, that what we do is we draw the water while it's still daytime, or ben hashmashot, or twilight. Then lashin bahem ad she'avur alehem halayla kulo. So he says, right, halacha is, even though this rabbi tried to be lenient about it, right, he said half the night was enough. But it says Bet Yosef, right, the prevailing opinion is like this, okay? What you got to do is let it sit all night, basically, right, until the morning, right, which is the dawn. So that's what you got to do, says Bet Yosef. And right, so again, right, what do you do? Bottom line, you draw the water during twilight time or a little bit before that, right, before sunset, and you just let it sit all night. And then once the dawn comes, the water is already nice and cool, so you can now make your matzot, right, in the morning if you want to, right, whatever, right? You can do it in the morning. First, go pray, right? Go pray shachrit, and then once you finish, make your matzot. Okay. So let's go on a little bit, right? So he says, "V'katav Aniyam Yorsal, v'chen Amad Avar Shavan ben Hashmashot." So he says, the Torah says, right, that the Rosh also writes that the proper thing to do is to draw the water during twilight time, right? V'chen katav b'tshuvatav. That's what it says also in the Tshuvot of the Rosh. Klal Yudalet, the Bet Yosef says, "V'zeh lashon Aruchot Chaim." This language of Aruchot Chaim shetzarich le'amidan b'makom meguleh. So he says you have to. This rabbi says, right, you got to put the water in an open place. That it should cool down. וצריך להשכים, להשכים, yeah, 1 second, I'm sorry. Yeah, להשכים להכניסם לבית טרם יזרח השמש. So it says what you got to do is, right, is get up early, like in the morning. In other words, before dawn, right, before sunrise. That's what he says, right? And bring them into the house, the water, right? Because once the sun comes up, it's going to heat the water up, right? So therefore, we got to bring it in from the outdoors there, what you have in your backyard, whatever it is. You got to bring it in, and before sunrise, this way, right? It'll be nice and cool from sitting all night outside, right? Okay, interesting. So it said that even applies, it says, when it's a cloudy day. So meaning what? That even though it's cloudy, it still can heat up the water, the sun, right? The scientists say that too, by the way. That, even on a cloudy day, the sun can heat something up. Even though you don't see the sun, but it does have its, heating power. It's still there. So therefore, he says, right, even on a cloudy day, you got to do that. You got to bring it in before sunrise. Okay. Good. So he says the custom is to put it under the ceiling because there's concern maybe they're going to do something with it. That all right. Okay, I see. So he says, right, that what you do is, right, when you're putting it outside, he says, in order to avoid this problem, that the sun is going to heat it up, because you may come to forget it, right, and leave it there until the sun comes up. So therefore, he says, what you do is, when you're putting it outside, at night, put it in a place where there's a ceiling over it, like a roof. So this way, right, even if the sun does come up and you forgot to bring it in, what's going to be is, right, that the roof will guard it from the sun. Okay, good. So ואם פשעו בזה נראה שאם לא נשתהו שם עד כדי שיחמו המים. So he says, what about if they made a mistake, right? Let's say, and they messed it up. What does that mean? They messed it up. That they left it out there, right? And they forgot to bring it in before the sun rose. So then, right, the sun started to hit it, right? The water. So is it what do you right? So what's halakha? Are you allowed to use that water or not? So he says, right, that if it didn't stay out there too long, right, it didn't stay out there long enough that it should get heated up by the sun. He found that the water is cool. Then you're allowed to knead with it. So b'diavad, right, if you forgot to bring it in, and the sun came up, as long as the water is still cool, you can use the water. Okay, so we have a little bit more here. כתב רש"י בתשובה, אין לשין אלא במים שלנו, שחששו חכמים לרוב עיירות. All right, so yeah, I guess we'll continue this one. Yeah, okay, we can continue. So we should look at the tour first, because we have to see the whole text. So it says the tour like this, right? It brings the Rashi. Katav Rashi b'tshuva. Rashi writes in the tshuva, En lashin ela b'mayim shelanu. So he says, right, that we only should use water, as we said, right, which was sat overnight. Shechashu chachamim lerov ayarot she'en lahem ela mei borot. So he says, why? Because the rabbis were concerned, right, that there are certain towns which have only spring water, right, or well water, right? And as we said, right, that spring water at night, in the daytime, right, it's at night it's hot. שחשו חכמים לרוב העיירות שאין בהן מעיינות שהן רותחין. So he says that's the problem, the water is hot because of the springs. ויראה מדבריו שבמי נהרות אין לחוש. So it says Beit Yosef, right, you see from there that when it comes to, like river water, let's say, right, there's no concern about this. So it's only with the spring water that there's a concern, or well water, because that water gets heated up at night. But says Beit Yosef, right, but nevertheless, we shouldn't be lenient. So what does that mean? Even if you draw the water from a river, you should still, right, let it sit overnight. אלא אם כן לנו, וכן יראה מלשון הבהג. That's what it seems from the בהג also comes out like that. שאינו מחלק, doesn't make a differentiation like that. שכתב ולא מבעיה במאיה דפושטרי. So it says that I don't have to tell you, right, when it comes to, what do you call it? I don't need to tell you when it comes to lukewarm water, that you're not allowed to, right? You're not allowed to knead with that. Even it says even not only that, but even if it's the water that comes from a river, the malu beyomayhu asur lalush. So it says you're not allowed to use that either, even though it's not as warm, right, as the lukewarm water that you're using from the spring. Lalush behu ad debaite, right? So in other words, he says, right, that even though the river water is colder, but you should be stringent, right, and not use it until it sits overnight. Okay. אסור ללוש בהו עד דבייתא. ואישה לא תלוש בחמין אפילו לא נתחממו, right? So it says also, says the woman should not, use hot water, to knead with that, even if it didn't get חמו אלא בחמה, even if it just got heated up in the sun. ולא במים אגרופים מן המוליאר. And it's not even like coming from the urn, right? It's not like the water from the hot water urn. Just the fact that it was in the sun, it's already a problem. והוא דוד גדול שנחושתו עבה ותלוי על מקום האש ומים שבתוכו פושטין, אפילו כשאין האש תחתיו. So he says, right, that even if the water is just like lukewarm, warm from the you have like this urn, right, hot water urn, and the water is not really on the fire, but just the fact that it's a little bit warm there, you shouldn't use it. It says if he transgressed and he kneaded with water like that, with the lukewarm water, according to the Rif, right, it's forbidden to use that water. Even if it's water that did not sit. So he said, all these rabbis also wrote like that. Well, Rashi davka bechamin. So it's according to Rashi, it's only with like hot water, or chama, or heated up in the sun. But it says water which didn't sit overnight. B'diavad, shara, it's allowed, right? And he says you can even use the chatchila sometimes to knead with it. If you don't have any other water besides that. Right? So it says the Rosh agreed to that. It says that which we forbid, if he transgressed, right, and needed, Piresh Avi Ezri, the Rabbi Ezri explains, Dafka Avra b'mezid, that means that he transgressed, right, willingly, Aval Shogeg, but when it comes to inadvertently, Shara, it's allowed. But Rashi Asar, Afilu Shogeg, but Rashi forbids even inadvertently. Uperush Od, he explains furthermore, Shasur Afilu B'achila, it's not even allowed to eat that mishum chashash chimutz, because of the concern about leavening. And even if he wants to eat, right, kazait of matzah for the mitzvah in the end, right, with something else, the gara b'mitzakot shelakum says this is even worse than the dough of the goyim. This kind of situation. Okay. So it says these two rabbis said it's only talking about matcha which is guarded. This is also water which didn't sit overnight. It's talking about matzah which is shmura matzah, a guarded matzah. But it says when it comes to eating just matzah, regular matzah, it's allowed. Because we hold, right, that you can even use a goisha, right, the loaves of these dough made from the goy. But you have to eat also for the mitzvah a different one, right, which is guarded. So the Rosh agrees with Rashi. They forbid that. Afilu shogeg, even if it was inadvertent. Even for eating. So he says a lot of people have this custom, right? This is important to know. That they don't put salt into the the bread on Passover, right? In other words, putting salt is not a good idea. And that's what we do, by the way. We don't put salt. When we make matzot, right? There's not one grain of salt in there. Right? נוהגים בכל אשכנז ואין טעם ברור לאסרו. So it says, that's the custom in Ashkenaz. מכל מקום אין לשנות משום אל תימות תורה, אל תיטוש תורת אמך. But he says, if there's a custom to use it, you can use it. ויש אומרים שבלילה הראשונה אין ליתן בה מלח. So he says, some say, right, that when it comes to the first night, you shouldn't put the salt in there. משום מצה עשירה, because it's like, rich matzah. egg matzah. וגם זה אינו שאינה נקראת עשירה. So he says that's also not true. It's not called, right, rich matzah, אלא שנדרושה ביין, unless it was needed with wine, ושמן or oil, ודבש or honey. אבל מלח אינו מעשירה. But it says the salt doesn't make it into rich matzah. קרסינה במנחות. Says we have the text over there, menachot, tavla, perush, lash, matzah, beketzach, beshum shemin. So he says he needed the matzah using, right, sesame, right, and v'chol minet tavlin, all kinds of spices. Keshera, it's kosher. Kivan sheyesh bat tam matzah, because it has the taste of matzah. Katuv b'sefer al-kiach. So it says in this book, but it says don't put pepper right into the matzah. Why is that? Because it's very sharp, right? And it heats it up. Right? So what are we saying over here, right? Bottom line is that you shouldn't put salt in there, right? And you shouldn't put pepper in there. So what does that mean, right? I'm not talking about after it was baked already. That you can do. I'm talking about before the baking, right? You're putting into the dough, right? That you shouldn't do because it heats it up, right? And therefore, right, it can become leavened. Sharp. Okay, so let's see the Shulchan Aruch here. Yeah, so let's take a look at this. It says in the Shulchan Aruch, "En lashin ela b'mayim shelanu," right? As we said, when you knead the dough, right, for the matzah, you have to use water which sat overnight. Ben shehem me barot u'mayinot, right? Whether it's spring water or well water, ben shehem me neharot, or it's even river, right? River water. Even though, as we said, right, the river water is not really so warm, but anyway, right, we make it uniform and we're stringent. So he says the proper custom is like this, right? We draw the water during the daytime. So what does that mean, right? It says in parentheses, samuch leben hashmashot. We do it right before, right before sunset. That's the time that we draw the water, right? And then we let it sit overnight, as we said, right? And so he says we shouldn't knead the dough until what? Until the whole night has elapsed. So what does that mean? You got to wait till the dawn, right? Once the dawn comes, you can start, kneading. So you got to let it sit all night, right? Not half the night, not most of the night, all night. So he says, right, you can draw water one day for many days. In other words, you can use that water for several days. Veim hazman cham. So he says, if it's a hot season, right? In other words, it's a hot weather, right? The weather is hot. So he says, what you should do is put it in the in the cellar, which is cold there, right? Veim hazman kar. So he says, if it's cold weather, right? You should put it into the air, just like in the air, right? In other words, outside. Because there, right, in a case like that, the cellar is warm. So as we said, right, in Beit Yosef, that you have to get up early, right, and make sure you bring in the water from outside. If you're having it outside, right, you got to bring it in before sunrise, because then otherwise, right, as we said, the sun will start to heat the water. So again, right, what did we just say? What's the procedure? Procedure is you draw the water before sunset. Okay, you let it sit all night until dawn. Right, and depending on the weather, right, you put it either in the cellar, right, or you put it outside. Depending on where it's colder, right, depending on the weather you have there. So, right, it says the Ramah here, "Ve'im lo yichnisam b'ashkama." So it says if he did not do that, right? Let's say, in other words, he didn't, as we said in the Beit Yosef, we already mentioned this. If he did, let's say he forgot to bring the water in before sunrise, right? Im lo amdu kol kach ad sheich says if it didn't stand too long there, right, until it gets warmed up, eno mazik, it doesn't hurt. It says it's okay. If the water is still cool, as we said, right, it's okay. So as we said, right, that it's better to put it if you're putting it outside, just in case you forget, right, to bring it in, before sunrise. So put it under like a ceiling, like a roof, some kind of canopy or whatever, right? And this way, just in case, right, if the sun does come up, it's not gonna heat it up. So he says, tachat, yeah. Second, yeah. So it says when he's taking the water, tachat avir arakia, right, under the sky, right. In other words, outdoors. Yesh lechasotanis, you should cover it. So if you're moving the water outside, he says, right, you should cover it when you do that. Keshechal Pesach, the Ramah says, Keshechal Pesach be'echad b'Shabbat. It says if Passover falls on Sunday, yesh lishova mayim or Yud Gimel. It says then you should draw the water on the 13th, right? In other words, before the 13th. So what does that mean? That Sunday is going to be, right, Passover, which is the 15th. So if it falls on that time, you should draw the water when? On Friday, right, before Shabbat. Dainu Belel Hey, right? No, I'm sorry, I didn't say it right. So he says, right, that's Thursday night. L'chadchila yesh lishov mina neharot velo mina berot. So he says, l'chadchila, better to draw the water from the river, as we said, because it's cooler, right? And not from the springs, not from the wells. But he says, if the river is very high because of the melting of the snow, right? The geshamim tov yoter lishov mina haberot. So it's better, right, to draw the water from the well. Okay, you know what? I guess we'll do this next time. We'll this Ramah, right? We'll continue next time, Ezrat Hashem. So we'll review the Shulchan Aruch, right, next time, the whole thing, but especially the Ramah, we'll go over that. Okay, thanks for coming tonight. Bezrat Hashem, be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. And we'll see you tomorrow. And Bezrat Hashem, Hashem should help us to defeat our enemies. Bezrat Hashem, we're doing a great job. It's going very, 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 very well. Even though our enemies, are trying to make some peace deals and this all kinds of stuff, but that's not what we need. We don't need a peace deal. What we need is to win the war. That's what we need, right? So don't let your enemies fool you. Unfortunately, some of our enemies happen to be people that we know very well, right, in this country. So whatever it is, right. I'm not going to mention any names, but Hashem should help us, to do the right thing, and not to listen to our enemies, who are trying to mess us up. Okay, very good. So, Bezrat Hashem, we'll see you tomorrow. Chazak Baruch, Laila Tov.
Kavod Harav, thank you so much.
All the best.